technology just means it's a bit of a scribble. I'm going to go through some of the projects, which is my brief, that I think touches on some of the things I've heard earlier in the conference and from Chris and from Davy, which is really around thinking differently, and is there a way of using resources and using what we have or new connections amongst different groups to actually solve some of the problems that the conference is looking at, and some of the challenges, particularly in the session I was just at earlier around deep retrofit. And it's interesting, Chris, you spoke about word cloud, which is just a way of testing the kind of temperature in the room, or what people have most, in our case, was most wrote about in the feedback. We're currently doing a project on universal design, looking at guidance for universal design, which is really around the future of homes. And this is really changing mindsets around universal design, being really about future-proofing, factoring in adaptability for everybody, which is really, the flip side of the coin of the kind of the energy efficient home as well. And it was interesting that where some people may have had the impression, because there's such a range of stakeholders, from home providers as well as home owners and occupiers and residents, as well as the designers, that they're saying, well, Ireland's built for the next 10 years, isn't it? Like, what's the point in doing guidance now? And the three top words that came from about 120 people we were talking to, Chris, was need, housing and design were the three top words from a range of, if you imagine, we're talking to all of the stakeholders involved in special needs, as well as people involved in all different aspects of housing. There was a sense that actually what we need is something that better meets the kind of the people who are living in the homes and wanting to live independently in their homes in particular. So just in terms of what Davy said around 4D planning and why we have it up there in terms of sustainable design, we have focused in a range of different projects in healthcare, in energy management and in local area development. And I suppose where many of the projects we've been involved in, it is really around that kind of mapping and understanding the local assets, which really is what that whole cultural planning and 4D planning approach is about. Looking at what you have and seeing how your opportunities can come out of that sense of understanding at a very much a local level, and seeing that how that can fit into practical projects. And I suppose my own way back kind of training was in archaeology, so I'm not going to talk about any of the specifics or technical aspects of some of the projects, but it's that sense that looking at what you have, looking at that sense of not just from a heritage perspective, but how people use places, not just today but over time, I suppose is key to many of the couple of projects I'll go through, where there has been some new mechanisms that have emerged which have informed policy measures, a couple of demonstration projects. And the emphasis is very much on that idea of changing mindsets and trying to make projects happen with fewer resources. And what struck me in terms of the Resilience Month, Davy, that you did with Cultivate in November, where I had been involved in a creative clustering project and been talking to people then in the leader groups, and had been involved in initially talking about the universal design piece. And there is a sense that you could almost change the word energy for creative for many of the issues that came up. It's like we're all trying to solve the same problem. And I think if there's that sense of maybe using some of the mechanisms that people have used in the projects we've been on, there may be opportunities that come out of that. So there's no one project that's typical, but just maybe to focus in on a couple of the ones. This is really for kind of big screen, so I'm not sure if you'll be able to read that. But just to mention some of the key ones in terms of Drimna, which I have up there first, Drimna Smarter Travel. This is, I suppose, at the end of last year in November, there was a situation where the local authority, Dublin City Council, had some money available through the department to quickly invest in a project in Drimna, which is an area in Dublin here, for those of you who aren't familiar with it. And what was interesting is that project happened, and there was a whole Smarter Travel programme of work that was launched last November that's ongoing this year, because of the work that had been done a couple of years before, where we did an integrated area plan taking a different approach. And I suppose the key message out of that project was that it was a different approach that the local authority took, in that we were commissioned to do a project, a framework that would look at the whole area of Drimna from a kind of social and economic, as well as I suppose an environmental and a physical perspective. But it wasn't about a regeneration project. It wasn't about a big development project. Drimna had felt it's got 12,000 households, for example, and it was not reacting to a potential development or a major project or a redevelopment, as many of the local authority housing developments came out of. This was a community wanting to look at how to plan for their own future in a very, I suppose, a strategic way, but based on what's there and thinking differently about it. Ended up being from Drury Drimna, as they were calling it at the time, to the Garden City, because the history of it going back to the 20s was around this idea of the Garden City model, a new type of model for a way of living in the city. And it has some of the most green areas and fantastic canal stretch and incredible long gardens, which by literally just mapping and representing that back to the community and working with them, that they started to think differently about new ways of living within the area, starting new initiatives, used all of the actual data that was captured to apply for the Smarter Travel programme that the department put out the year before last year. They were shortlisted. They had a project to run for 5 years, which was at about 6 million. While they were waiting to say, are we getting the 6 million to do a whole series of public realm and development and behavioural change initiatives, they heard last year, you didn't get it, you haven't won, and here's a bit of money that happened a couple of months later from Dublin City Council. And it was extraordinary to see that because the new relationships had been built up between the community, the public and private sectors in the area, because they had already imagined in a very practical way, not a wish list of all the wonderful things, but a really practical way of enhancing what they had already been worked out. They're now developing and looking at a programme of trying to achieve that through collaborative action and through finding other pockets of money, and really around developing a whole behavioural change, and some of which is kind of voluntary movement in the Drimna area. In terms of what we were talking about earlier, because that mechanism and collaboration is there for people to work together, why not a retrofit programme of 12,000 homes, which is all very similar housing stock in Drimna. So it's using that mechanism to deliver something in a quicker time frame around something like the retrofitting homes, and it would be a great model for that. At the moment, they're just looking at the Smarter Travel. In terms of the Sustainable Energy Community one, I suppose this is most relevant to many of the discussions today. This is work we did for a number of years with Sustainable Energy Ireland. The end result of it is the Sustainable Energy Communities Network, just launched last year. And that was looking at, we did research on all the 34 local authorities, talking to them about where structured energy management sat within their development plans, their county development plans, and within the organisation. And this was really building on, are you familiar with the Dundalk 2020 model? Yeah. So this was very much building on that, which was delivered, very much championed by SEAI, but now looking to see how can the local authorities deliver this. And I suppose the important thing is that, instead of doing what the initial idea was, well, put out a competition and see what happens, then the obvious cutbacks came, and it was trying to find a different mechanism, a different way of delivering sustainable energy by the local authorities acting in a different way in terms of the development and particularly the economic department. So it wasn't where before it might have been seen that energy sat within perhaps waste or water, or it sat within a very technical component within the local authorities. It was bringing a structured energy management approach. The network is because 14 very, very strong applications actually came through that process. It was a two-stage competitive process that meant that there was a whole engagement with the team that was set up, and it was, in some instances it was a case of where there hadn't been that kind of a cross, if you like, internal departmental approach taken to many initiatives before within the local authorities. Some had started on the energy map that SEI do, but many had been working on specific projects, but there wasn't a tradition, unless there were major regeneration projects, of a kind of cross-sectoral approach that was needed for the sustainable energy communities. And really it's around taking a structured approach and then the local authority enabling a match between supply and demand in a local area. And so that would involve everything from major users like hospitals and schools, and then looking at different ways of feeding that through the supply and engaging with a whole variety of stakeholders within a local area. But the key thing that SAI are providing is a support and a whole kind of technical support and various different toolkits that we developed with them. That means that everybody isn't reinventing the wheel on a county-by-county basis, and that everybody isn't trying to redo an ESCO contract or redo a particular contract for renewable energy. It's saying, we've already been through the things that did work and the things that didn't work in Dundalk, so we're going to share that information and set up a network so that it can be done in that kind of joined-up approach. And the key thing that was needed was actually that kind of project coordination and management support and the knowledge. So it was funny, actually, at one of the sessions we did, the launch of it, somebody came up from a department and said to me, I've never seen so many directors of services and county managers and people at an event to launch a project that has very little money at the end of it. And what it was about was actually a process of supporting and working with the local authorities, but then seeing how they can work in the local areas. it's just interesting that two of the, there's 14 of them involved in the network, and as I say, it's just been started last year, but it was interesting that two of the ones that ended up being awarded by SEAI and the panel that was set up to assess all of the proposals, the two winning sustainable energy communities, it's facilitated by the local authority but delivered through a public and private and community partnership, was Tralee Sustainable Energy Community. And it's interesting that one of the initiatives where they're looking at local cooperative harvesting and marketing ventures and looking at security of supply, that they're looking at a retrofitting upgrading programme and is a pay-as-you-use project. So, you know, it's very topical and very, very relevant to what was being discussed earlier. Likewise, South Dublin and Dublin City Council are looking at very much that evidence-based approach, looking at how you can engage private and public users in the competitiveness to look at how to match that supply and demand, and also taking that kind of international perspective and looking at EU opportunities and specific funding actually that will channel into it. But that network would be interesting to see how it develops and how it can feed into other grassroots initiatives that are happening in the area. Davy spoke about the kind of green business and creative businesses. This was a project that started out a couple of years ago in Sligo. And again, I suppose the outcome of it was that it started out as being a plan, a PPP, a standard kind of PPP type approach that the local authority were going to do in a particular area where, if you're familiar, the Model Arts Centre is up in Sligo. And in fact, they decided then that, you know, the 140 million project was not going to fly as the housing market or the development market was just changing. We did a whole mapping project in and around the area in Sligo, and what resulted, that was just launched in March of this year. A couple of years later, again, it was based on solid kind of mapping and engagement process with people locally. They actually developed, we put together a Creative Sligo strategy. It was very much looking at new technologies, creative businesses, and feeding that into the potential for, I suppose, the whole kind of wind and wave in the West in terms of particularly around energy supply. A creative public-private partnership, a very small, tight team was set up that could feed into all the other areas of cultural tourism, green businesses, creative enterprises, and it won a bid that we prepared for them last year, which is called the European Creative Industry Alliances. So it's one of only 8 projects selected by the Department of Industry and Enterprise last year, where they're looking at how can you have that more kind of joined up approach for SMEs and businesses to look at opportunities from a kind of a European point of view. And that is really around local group who have raised money, local businesses, linked to monies that the local authority, local tourism, and local the individual agencies that work in these areas. It was around pooling that resources and then setting up a very simple project, not a new structure, but really a way of pooling the resources and not everybody trying to reinvent the wheel. I should have said, sorry, it's now got 6 counties in the Northwest. That's why it's called a Creative Northwest Cluster. And then just lastly, I'll just speak where, I suppose, if you're drilling down into something that isn't just around clustering, but a specific project. This was Great Northern Haven in Dundalk, which was really looking at independent housing, but a new collaborative approach between the HSE Northeast, the local authorities in Louth, the Dundalk Institute of Technology, and then funded through SEAI, the Department of the Environment, as well as Atlantic Philanthropies. This is a build project where people live. They've been living there. It's around testing new technologies that can enable people to live independently and longer in their own homes. Why it's interesting in particular is that it is a demonstration project that's feeding into a national initiative. It was seen as, I suppose, a key project because it responded to a need in the local area. It was around designing in a social, affordable housing context something that is future-proofed, that is around an energy-efficient home, but most importantly can be applied to anyone's home in the future. So therefore it's feeding into a whole research project and a national initiative, and in fact what became one small project, if you like, of homes for people in the local area became a Louth Age-friendly city, which the county manager says is very much really looking at the planning system and the development plan and the county development plan, not from just older people, but literally from the youngest to the oldest, and really rethinking how they approach their whole work of the local authority in a completely different way. It's linked into the WHO at international level, and this was showcased in the first time the International Age-Friendly Cities event happened actually just last year. And this was one of the projects people visited because it's actually feeding into, I suppose, what you're saving in terms of the initial investment in a home to allow people to use new technologies and just clever design to be able to live independently for longer with peace of mind, and to be able to easily adapt your house. I suppose the really important aspect of it was trying to do that in an affordable way, and also how it would actually feed into a commercial kind of private sector application. So Enterprise Ireland have funded within the Dundalk Institute of Technology a project called Casala, and that's where people are looking at design, not just of homes or adaptation, but actually of products. Because what we found is in trying to even find the kind of products, it's this awful, like, institutionalized, very, very old traditional approach to, you know, if you're older, you fit into this bracket, and therefore this is the kind of design that you should be getting, or whatever. And it's a bit like the project we're doing now in universal design. It's really about good design, clever design, and really person-centred design. So this is one key project that Louth are driving. And I think there's six age-friendly counties around Ireland at the moment, and it's something that's very much starting with one small local action that's collaborative, and then feeding into national policy and finding new ways of funding streams that support that. So I suppose just to finish up, there are mindset challenges in delivering all of those projects, and I suppose that I would all say Davy would be tired of saying that I've been very lucky to work on a number of projects where it's working between the community, the public, or the private sector. And I think, I so many times hear people talking about the bottom up and the top down. I'd love if people could just move on from that and actually say that, is there a new way of working where it's about pooling the resources, really effectively spending the money, because there is money being spent today on lots of different initiatives, government money being spent, and there are possibilities to pool those resources and look at projects in the future. There's clearly a need and demand and an opportunity, which we're hearing about today. And I think the key thing is trying to deliver that in terms of the implementation, I suppose, approach of working together. We've found that sense of taking an approach where you're really looking at mapping the assets, knowing what you have, and focusing on the resources that are there, and then feeding that into existing models. So you're not creating a dependency or control or putting in new layers of new structures. It's about actually working within the structures and seeing if people can collaborate in a different way, and get rid of the old county rivalry, as well as the local kind of rivalry, to work on specific projects. I think in any of the sessions that we've gone into, I think there's been an awful lot of talk, and people like to talk about shared visions. We find it much easier to just say can we just agree on a shared purpose and a project that we're going to do together. And we found that actually working on a shared project, maybe that's me because we're called MCO projects, it's much easier trying to address the mindset issue. So the behavioural change happens after you do a project together, you find it works, and then the behaviours start to change, which is the case. And I hope I've presented in some of these. The post-occupancy evaluation and checking as we go along has been hugely important. So putting in at the outset a way of monitoring and measuring and metering those projects and seeing what the outcome is. And then in terms of looking at the toolkits, rather than doing it, if you like, for people, it's a case of very cleverly putting in structures and toolkits that people can use, a bit like the Sustainable Energy Communities one, where it's not reinventing the very kind of, say, technical aspects that can be reapplied, and those toolkits have been used. So I suppose my kind of question in terms of the joined up thinking, is there an opportunity for a community of practice which would allow that greater connectedness? Because in every session that we've gone into, there's that sense of people say something like, well, that's a good idea, and I think it's incredibly simple and incredibly practical, but just if all of the agencies, the public and the private sector at local level would look at what are the resources and the opportunities, and take that structured approach which has been taken in the Energy Master Plan approach, I think it can be applied across lots of different models in terms of the resilience in a local area. So I hope that's covered some of the points you wanted, Davy, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.